25 years ago, a family in southern England looked at their 3,500-acre farm, 200 years in the same hands, and made a decision that horrified their neighbors. They stopped farming it, not scaled back, stopped. That should have been the end of the land. Weald clay is some of the worst soil in Britain for agriculture, and this farm had spent 17 straight years bleeding money, kept alive only by subsidy checks. By every rule of British farming, walking away meant surrender. Instead, the survey results came back, and even the people who'd made the decision didn't believe them. Bird populations up ninefold, dragonflies and damselflies up 800%, and a bird that hadn't nested anywhere in Britain in 6 centuries turned up on this land, building a nest. Here's the part that doesn't add up. The theory behind what they did wasn't accepted science. It was, to most of the ecological establishment, heresy, an idea that the textbook picture of ancient Europe, closed canopy forest from coast to coast, was wrong. That instead, wild animals had been the ones shaping the landscape all along, not humans, not trees left alone. So they tested it. They pulled out the fences. They let cattle, pigs, and ponies wander the fields like architects with no blueprint. If you're the kind of person who wants to see nature prove the experts wrong, hit like and subscribe. We're tracking every rewilding story like this one, and you won't want to miss where this land ended up next. What happened to the soil and to the farm's balance sheet is the part almost nobody saw coming. Before the stalks, before the ninefold surge in birdsong, this was simply a farm losing money. Weald clay sits low, drains poorly, and compacts under machinery. Agronomists rank it among the worst arable soils in England. For 17 years, the family drilled wheat into it anyway, chasing yields that never matched the national average. The numbers told the real story. Subsidy payments weren't a bonus on top of profit. They were the only thing keeping the operation upright. Every autumn brought the same pattern. Diesel costs climbing, milk and grain prices flat or falling, debt rolling forward instead of shrinking. This wasn't a farm in decline. It was a farm on life support, propped up by government checks written to keep failing land in production rather than to reward what it actually produced. By 2000, the ledger had already made the decision the family hadn't yet admitted out loud. Farming this land at this scale was no longer viable. Something had to change. What they chose instead wouldn't just break with tradition. It would put them on the wrong side of nearly everyone in British agricultural science. To understand what they did next, you have to go back further than the farm, back before agriculture existed at all. For decades, ecologists assumed prehistoric Europe was one unbroken canopy of forest, tree after tree from the Atlantic to the Urals. It was taught as fact. It was printed in textbooks. One Dutch ecologist, Frans Vera, disagreed. He argued the ancient landscape wasn't solid forest, it was a mosaic. Open grassland, thorny scrub, and loose woodland, all shaped not by soil or climate, but by the grazing and rooting of wild herds, aurochs, wild boar, tarpan. Remove the animals, Vera claimed, and the mosaic collapses into monotonous forest. The response from his peers was swift dismissal, in some circles, outright hostility, a theory with no living proof, built on an idea nobody could test, because the animals that once shaped Europe were long extinct. But Charlie and Isabella didn't need Vera to be right in theory. They needed him to be right on their land. So they decided to run the experiment no one else had dared attempt, using animals as a substitute for a world that vanished centuries ago. The first fences came down in 2002. Not damaged, deliberately dismantled, mile after mile of Victorian field boundaries torn out until the estate's 3,500 acres became one continuous, borderless expanse. Then came the animals, not chosen for appearance or breed prestige, but for behavior. Old English longhorn cattle, selected as stand-ins for the extinct aurochs, engineered to graze and trample rather than sit fattening in a paddock. Tamworth pigs, released to root and disturb soil the way wild boar once did, tearing up turf that had gone undisturbed for a century. Exmoor ponies, chosen for their relentless, indiscriminate browsing, chewing through bramble and scrub other grazers ignore. No one told these animals where to go. That was the entire point. They wandered wherever hunger, shelter, or instinct pulled them, trampling some patches to bare earth, leaving others to grow wild and thorny. Within months, patterns began emerging that no human land manager would have designed: uneven, chaotic, alive. The estate's ecologists expected disturbance. What they didn't expect was what would grow out of it. Because the mess these animals were making wasn't damage at all. It was about to become the most productive habitat in the country. The scrub that ecologists once would have cleared as waste ground turned out to be the engine of everything. Blackthorn, bramble, and thistle, the very thorns the old farm manuals called a nuisance, became nursery ground for young oak and hawthorn, sheltering seedlings from grazing animals long enough to take root. What looked like neglect was actually rocket fuel for the entire system. Then the surveys started confirming it. Breeding bird numbers climbed ninefold across the estate. Nightingales, a species vanishing everywhere else in Britain, found refuge in the scrub nobody had bothered to cut back. Turtle doves, down catastrophically nationwide, began holding steady here, one of the only places in the country where that was true. Insects followed the same trajectory. Dragonflies and damselflies surged more than 800% as ponds silted, flooded, and reshaped themselves without drainage pipes controlling the water table. Purple emperor butterflies, among Britain's rarest, began turning up in numbers researchers hadn't seen anywhere else in the country. None of this had been planted, seeded, or planned. But the biggest surprise wasn't ecological at all. It was about to show up on the balance sheet. For 17 years, this land had run on debt. Now the ledger told a different story. Beneath the trampled scrub and root-torn earth, something invisible had been rebuilding the entire time, soil microbial life, recovering, carbon settling back into ground that decades of plowing had stripped bare. Undisturbed by tillage, the clay was doing what clay does when left alone, locking carbon away instead of releasing it. That alone would have been remarkable. But the real shock came when the accountants ran the numbers. The estate now earns more than it ever did under the plow, not despite abandoning agriculture, but because of it. Free-roaming livestock require no feed, no housing, no veterinary overhead of an intensive dairy herd. Ecotourism, safari-style wildlife tour, and premium meat sales from animals that spent their lives grazing wild scrubland now outperform what wheat and milk ever generated on this soil. 17 years of subsidy dependence had ended, not with more farming, with less. The land that once needed government checks to survive had turned itself into an economic model other landowners were now studying. But of everything that returned to this place, one arrival would matter more than any spreadsheet. There's a village not far from Knepp that's carried the same name for centuries, one referencing storks, a bird that hadn't nested anywhere in the country since long before this farm existed. For 600 years, that name was a memory, a word detached from the thing it described. Then, on this reclaimed land, storks returned and built a nest of their own accord. That's the moment this story stops being about one farm. A failing dairy operation, fences torn down, a theory the experts called heresy, cattle and pigs left to wander without instruction, thorny scrub nobody bothered to clear, birds up ninefold, insects surging by the hundreds of percent, soil quietly rebuilding itself underground, a balance sheet that improved the less anyone managed it. Once you line those up, a pattern emerges that has nothing to do with birds or bison or budgets. It's about what happens when we stop assuming a landscape is finished simply because it looks exhausted. So here's the question worth sitting with. How many landscapes have we already written off, as farmed out, as damaged beyond repair, as somebody else's problem that were never actually incapable of recovery? They were just waiting for someone to stop managing them. If stories like this matter to you, subscribe and join us as we uncover how animals continue to reshape the world around us. This wasn't the only farm where doing less produced more. Somewhere else, on a very different landscape, a different animal was quietly rewriting what scientists thought they knew, and that story starts with an experiment nobody expected to work at all. The land was never truly finished. It was only waiting to be asked.